Islam Makhachev could be in a bit of trouble after his recent fight with Alexander Volkanovski. On the 13th of February, Dan Hooker, Volkanovski's teammate, made some allegations on Twitter, stating that they had found Makhachev had hired a nurse to give him an IV during fight week. Volkanovski himself was also on the MMA Hour earlier that week with Ariel Helwani, where he did insinuate that Makhachev may have used an IV.
I don't need him to be a featherweight. Like, he can be a welterweight. He can go fight wherever we fight. He can get as big as he wants with IVs and whatever he does. It doesn't matter. You watch what happens next time.
Also, Volkanovski's coach Eugene Behrman appeared on the MMA Hour later that week, and he gave his opinion on the accusations.
We have reliable information to a point. The information, it falls short because for several reasons, and I don't know how information can tell us that without a doubt that someone in their team is in that forward use an IV bag to rehydrate, which is not illegal if you're using 100 mils. You just got to ask yourself, if it's only 100 mils, you're going to use it in 12 hours, why would you even bother?
Obviously, this whole situation has sparked a lot of controversy online, and there's been opinions and misinformation flying about everywhere, mainly as there was very little evidence other than the allegations themselves. Some people were pointing to a picture of Islam before the fight with a raised vein in his arm, but I don't believe we can look too much into that. What made the story a lot more interesting was Makhachev's manager, in a now deleted tweet, stated, "For all those idiots out there, any fighter under the UFC banner can take 2 to 3 litres of IV as long as it's done by a nurse or a professional. Next week, I'm going to expose everybody. Islam Makhachev is the pound-for-pound king." He basically insinuated that Islam may have used an IV, but it was legal to do so as it lay between 2 and 3 litres, and it was administered by a nurse. Ali Abdelaziz is way off the mark here, and this highlights one of the main issues within MMA, which is the lack of education around anti-doping for the fighters and the athlete support personnel. So we're referring there to coaches, managers, or trainers. As an anti-doping educator myself, I thought I could shed some light on all the misinformation that's going on, so let's dive into what the rules actually tell us. Under the World Anti-Doping Code, IV use is prohibited in and out of competition for 3 primary reasons. Number 1, they can potentially enhance performance by increasing plasma volume. Number 2, they can mask the presence of a prohibited substance by diluting urine and blood samples. Or number 3, they can distort the values of the athlete biological passport, which is used to longitudinally track athletes' hematology to help detect substances like EPO. So if a drug-tested athlete used an IV, they would be subject to an anti-doping rule violation. Well, maybe. Unfortunately, it's not that black and white. In fact, you can use an IV, but only if IV infusions or injections are less than a total of 100 mils in a 12-hour period, or if legitimately received in the course of hospital treatments, surgical procedures, clinical diagnostic investigations, and or those that are determined to be medically justified and within the standard of care by a licensed physician and administered by a licensed medical professional. This is directly from the UFC's published USADA Prohibited list, which is adapted from the World Anti-Doping Code. So Islam could have used an IV if it was less than 100 mils over a 12-hour period. Usually, any IV of less than 100 mils would be to administer a medication and not for rehydration. However, larger IVs can be used under Therapeutic Use Exemptions or TUEs, but only under specific criteria. Those criteria are if the prohibited substance or prohibited method in question is prescribed to treat a diagnosed medical condition supported by relevant clinical evidence, or if the therapeutic use of the prohibited substance or method will not produce any additional performance enhancement beyond what might be anticipated by the return of the athlete's normal state of health following the treatment of the medical condition, or the prohibited substance or prohibited method is an indicated treatment for the medical condition, and there is no reasonable permitted therapeutic alternative that is reasonably accessible to such athlete. And finally, the necessity for the use of the prohibited substance or prohibited method is not a consequence, wholly or in part, of the prior use without a TUE of a substance or method which was prohibited at the time of such use. So generally, TUEs can be granted for prohibited substances, but only in very specific circumstances. Any TUE application for an IV during fight week would have to take place as soon as possible, and it's highly unlikely that they would have the time to file and be granted a TUE ahead of time in that period. In fact, a TUE can be granted for an IV retroactively too, but again, only if they fall under these criteria, and there's no guarantee that they will be granted retroactively. Let's also go back to that definition on the prohibited list. Determined to be medically justified and within the standard of care by a licensed physician. There's a couple of grey areas here. For example, what is deemed medically justifiable has an element of subjectivity about it. Plus, could this be any physician, or does it have to be one allocated from the UFC or the Athletic Commission? Or could potentially the athlete have their own physician that could deem it medically justifiable to use an IV? This is the point that Brett Okamoto was getting at in his tweets. It's definitely a bit of a grey area that hopefully the UFC athletes have a bit of guidance on personally from the Golden Snitch. If it's as blatant as Brett says, it's almost not worth having the rule there in the first place. Either way, USADA's relationship with the UFC has not always been to the book. The John Jones situation with turinable pulsing showed that USADA are willing to bend the World Anti-Doping Code for the UFC. So Islam could be in trouble with USADA, but that's unlikely. However, it's not just USADA to worry about. Athletic commissions have their own policies separate from the UFC's anti-doping code. As Jeff Nowitzki outlined in his Twitter post, athletes must obtain permission from the Athletic Commission before an IV and must disclose the use of that IV to the Athletic Commission after using it. The sanctioning Athletic Commission for UFC 284 in Perth was the Government of Western Australia's Combat Sports Commission. As their website is government owned, you do need a VPN in order to access it. A big thank you to @DefNotMido on Twitter for sending across the documents listed on their website and helping me access the information. In their Code of Conduct document, the Commission's standpoint on IV use is quite clear. The Commission also prohibits the use of intravenous therapies which are used for aiding rehydration from excessive and deliberate dehydration. Any promoter, trainer, or other person registered with the Commission found to be encouraging the use of such methods will be sanctioned by the Commission. Any contestant known to be using these methods will not be allowed to compete. This is pretty blatant. If someone uses an IV, they would have broken the rules. But in another document on their website, the Contestant Preparation Standards and Guidelines, they echo some similar points outlined in the WADA code. Rehydration through the use of IV fluids can be dangerous, and the Commission strongly discourages their use except for medical reasons. The use of IV fluids without a medical reason contravenes the World Anti-Doping Agency code and will result in a ban from competition. If an IV is required for medical reasons, a contestant must obtain a TUE from the treating doctor. They also state beforehand in the document that the Combat Sports Commission recognises the World Anti-Doping Agency rules and hence the World Anti-Doping Code. Therefore, it's not completely obvious and there is an element of contradiction across the two documents. In my opinion, it's highly likely that they employ the same rules as the UFC when it comes to IV use, as they're both based on the World Anti-Doping Code. So there are three key points to this situation. Number one, was an IV disclosed to the Commission? Number two, what volume of IV was used? And number three, was the IV deemed medically justifiable by a licensed physician? If Makhachev did use an IV during the UFC 284 fight week, he could have broken the commission rules, but only if A, he didn't disclose it to the commission, B, it was over 100 mils in less than 12 hours, and C, he was not guided to do so by a licensed physician, or it was not applied by a medical practitioner. There's definitely some evidence to suggest an IV was potentially used, but potential is the key word. There's no hard evidence here, just accusations and a bit of speculation. So what should we expect? Well, if a UFC athlete breaks commission rules, then they usually receive a fine and a suspension, plus fights can be overturned. The specifics for the Western Australia Combat Sports Commission will have to be determined. Plus there may be some lobbying efforts from the UFC to influence any potential outcome, as they have a history of doing just this. It will be an interesting one to watch, and we love a bit of drama in MMA. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. Do you think Makhachev used an IV? Should the fight be overturned? Also, if you have any questions or queries about anything I've covered in this video, just fire a comment in the section down below. I'll see you in the next one.